John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago, where his early life unfolded within a troubled household shaped by instability and fear. His father, described as abusive and alcoholic, imposed a constant atmosphere of criticism that deeply affected Gacy's emotional development. From a young age, he struggled to gain approval, yet the validation he sought remained out of reach. This persistent rejection contributed to growing feelings of inadequacy and isolation that defined much of his childhood. As he matured, these experiences shaped a complex internal state marked by low self-worth and emotional conflict. Gacy attempted to cope with the neglect he endured, but the lack of support reinforced his sense of disconnection from others. Despite this, he began to develop an outward composure, presenting himself in a more controlled and socially acceptable manner. This contrast between his internal struggles and external behavior became an early indicator of the duality that would later define his life. Throughout his youth, the absence of consistent emotional support reinforced his desire for recognition and acceptance. He continued seeking approval in ways that allowed him to maintain a sense of control, even as underlying insecurities remained. These formative conditions did not disappear. Instead, they influenced how he adapted to later environments. By the time he approached adulthood, Gacy had already begun to balance this internal instability with an outward appearance of normalcy. The patterns established during his childhood would contribute to his ability to conceal deeper issues, allowing him to present a controlled identity despite unresolved emotional conflict that continued beneath the surface. This progression from early hardship to managed outward behavior reflects how his childhood experiences shaped not only his emotional state, but also his capacity to hide it. The unresolved tension between vulnerability and control remained a defining feature as he moved forward into adult life, carrying with him the lasting effects of neglect and criticism that had shaped him early. John Wayne Gacy's transformation from a troubled child into a seemingly successful and trustworthy adult marked a significant shift in how he was perceived by those around him. Despite his difficult upbringing, he managed to build a life that appeared stable and respectable, presenting himself as a businessman and an active member of his community. Through this role, he gained the trust and confidence of many people who interacted with him. His presence in the community was marked by a consistent effort to appear reliable, friendly, and socially engaged, reinforcing the image of a dependable individual. This image was not accidental, but rather carefully constructed to establish acceptance and authority within his environment. Beneath this outward stability, however, existed a clear contrast between appearance and reality. Gacy maintained a dual identity, presenting himself as approachable and dependable while concealing deeper psychological disturbances. This contrast became a defining element of his life and would later play a critical role in how he was able to operate unnoticed. His public persona extended into community activities, where he participated in social events and engaged with families, further strengthening the perception of him as harmless. One notable example of this was his role as Pogo the Clown, a character he used to entertain children and reinforce his approachable image. By adopting this persona, he presented himself as someone who could be trusted without hesitation, masking the deeper realities hidden beneath the surface. His involvement in such roles contributed to the broader sense of normalcy that surrounded him. This carefully maintained public identity allowed him to operate within society without raising suspicion, as his outward behavior aligned with expectations of a respectable citizen. The contrast between his appearance and his inner reality remained concealed behind this constructed image. However, this carefully built identity also enabled him to gain access to environments where he could exert influence and maintain control, all while reinforcing the trust placed in him by those around him. This balance between perception and reality ultimately defined the way he navigated his public life. This duality remained central to understanding how his outward success contrasted sharply with the reality hidden behind his carefully maintained facade. John Wayne Gacy lived in Norwood Park, where his residence became the setting for the events that would later define the investigation. His house stood within a typical suburban environment, presenting no outward signs of anything unusual or threatening. To neighbors and those who encountered him, the property appeared ordinary, consistent with the expectations of a quiet residential area. This ordinary appearance played a key role in how the true nature of what occurred inside remained concealed. Gacy maintained a friendly and approachable demeanor, which helped him integrate into the community without drawing attention. His interactions with neighbors and acquaintances reinforced the perception that he was a reliable and socially engaged individual. This outward behavior allowed him to establish trust, further supporting the image he had carefully built over time. The house itself functioned as more than just a living space. It became a private environment where his hidden actions could take place without interference. Within this setting, the contrast between his public identity and private reality became more pronounced. While his exterior life remained consistent with community expectations, the interior of his home represented a separate and concealed existence. This duality defined how Gacy operated within both his personal and social environments, allowing him to maintain control over how he was perceived while keeping his true actions hidden. The separation between appearance and reality remained stable, with no visible indication to those around him that anything was amiss. His ability to maintain this balance contributed directly to the lack of suspicion surrounding his home. It is within this context that the environment in Norwood Park can be understood as the backdrop to a concealed and disturbing reality. The house, though outwardly ordinary, contained within it a reality that stood in stark contrast to the neighborhood surrounding it. This contrast reinforced the theme of dual existence, where what was seen publicly did not reflect what existed privately. This section concludes by establishing the foundation for the events that followed, emphasizing how the carefully maintained separation between public and private life allowed the situation within the house to remain hidden for an extended period. The lack of awareness from those outside enabled the conditions inside to persist without interruption. This environment ultimately sets the stage for the patterns of behavior that would later be revealed through the investigation. All of this underscores the silent divide between perception and reality that defined his life. From 1972 to 1978, John Wayne Gacy carried out a series of crimes that followed a consistent and calculated pattern. During this period, he targeted young boys and teenage males, individuals who could be approached without immediately raising suspicion. His established reputation in the community played a crucial role in enabling this behavior, as it allowed him to appear trustworthy and approachable to those around him. Gacy used manipulation as his primary method of gaining access to his victims. He would offer opportunities such as work, money, or simple acts of kindness, presenting himself as someone willing to help. This approach allowed him to lower the defenses of those he targeted, making them more likely to trust and accompany him. The sense of normalcy he projected was an important factor in how he was able to interact with his victims without drawing attention. Once trust was established, his actions followed a repeated and controlled pattern. The crimes were not random, but were carried out with a sense of planning and consistency. His behavior demonstrated a cycle of manipulation, control, and violence, forming a structured approach that remained hidden over time. This pattern reinforced the idea that his actions were deliberate rather than impulsive. Throughout this period, Gacy maintained his outward image as a respectable member of the community. This reputation provided him with the cover needed to continue his activities without detection. The contrast between his public identity and his private actions remained a key element in how he was able to operate for an extended period without interference. The crimes continued over several years, reflecting both persistence and concealment. His ability to maintain this dual existence allowed him to avoid suspicion, even as his actions became more frequent. The lack of detection during this time highlights how effectively his public persona shielded his private behavior. Each of these actions contributed to a growing pattern that remained hidden beneath the surface of his everyday life. The consistency of his methods and the duration over which they were carried out demonstrate the extent to which he was able to control both his environment and the perception of those around him. This sustained period of undetected activity ultimately sets the stage for the eventual disruption of his secrecy and the investigation that followed. This section begins with the disappearance of Robert Piest in 1978, which marked a turning point in the case. His sudden disappearance caused concern and led to the initiation of a missing persons investigation. Authorities began examining his last known movements, focusing on tracing the timeline of his activities prior to his disappearance. This process was methodical and based on available information, gradually narrowing the focus of the investigation. As investigators followed the trail, certain details began to point toward John Wayne Gacy as a person of interest. What initially appeared to be a routine missing persons case began to take on a more serious direction, as inconsistencies and emerging information aligned with Gacy's involvement. This shift marked the first significant break in uncovering the truth behind the case. Investigators increased their focus as suspicion began to build around Gacy, leading to further scrutiny of his activities and behavior. The development of the case reflected a clear progression from uncertainty to growing evidence that required deeper investigation. This stage of the investigation played a critical role in shifting the direction of the case toward uncovering the extent of Gacy's actions. As the focus intensified, authorities began implementing surveillance measures and gathering additional evidence to support their suspicions. These efforts brought them closer to revealing the reality behind the disappearance and setting the stage for further discoveries that would follow. The investigation continued to evolve as more information came to light, reinforcing the importance of this turning point in the case. It ultimately transitioned from a simple missing persons report into a complex and deeply significant investigation that exposed a far more serious situation beneath the surface. The continued surveillance of Gacy became a key part of the investigation as officers worked to confirm their suspicions. His behavior and statements were carefully observed for inconsistencies. Evidence collected during this phase strengthened the case against him and increased the urgency of the inquiry. Each new detail contributed to a clearer understanding of the events surrounding Robert P.S.'s disappearance and the possible involvement of Gacy in that case, and others linked to similar patterns of concern within the investigation. This marked a critical stage where suspicion transitioned into active pursuit of truth. The investigation into the disappearance of Robert P.S. led authorities to focus more closely on the activities of John Wayne Gacy and his residence. As police continued surveillance, they observed behavior that raised further concern, prompting a more direct examination of the property. This step was not immediate, but resulted from accumulating observations and inconsistencies that could not be ignored. Among the most notable factors was an unusual odor detected around the house, which, combined with Gacy's suspicious actions, intensified the urgency of the investigation. These elements contributed to the decision by authorities to search the property more thoroughly. Once inside the house, investigators proceeded with caution, systematically examining the structure and its surroundings. Their attention eventually turned to the area beneath the home, specifically a crawl space that had not yet been fully explored. It was in this concealed space that they made a discovery that would fundamentally alter the course of the investigation. The remains of numerous victims were found buried beneath the house, confirming the suspicions that had been building during the surveillance phase. This discovery provided undeniable evidence of extensive criminal activity and revealed the true scale of the situation. What had begun as a missing persons case had now expanded into something far more severe, with clear physical evidence linking Gacy to multiple victims. The presence of these remains transformed the case from one of suspicion to one supported by direct and undeniable proof. Investigators were faced with the full reality of what had been hidden beneath the surface of an otherwise ordinary home. The findings at the house marked a critical turning point in the investigation. With concrete evidence now established, authorities were able to move forward with certainty in building their case. The discovery not only confirmed their suspicions, but also provided the foundation for legal action. This moment represented the transition from investigation to prosecution, as the evidence gathered on-site solidified the case against Gacy and led directly toward his arrest and the legal proceedings that would follow. The impact of this discovery was immediate, reshaping the entire direction of the case and confirming the severity of the crimes committed there. The arrest of John Wayne Gacy marked the end of his criminal activities and the beginning of a complex legal process. Following the discovery of evidence beneath his home, authorities took him into custody, bringing an immediate halt to the actions that had remained hidden for years. However, his arrest also raised new and significant questions regarding his mental state and level of responsibility for the crimes he was accused of committing. During the trial, the defense presented the argument that Gacy was legally insane and therefore not in control of his actions. This position sought to challenge the extent of his accountability by suggesting that his mental condition impaired his ability to understand or control his behavior. The insanity plea became a central element of the defense strategy, focusing on his psychological state as the key factor in determining responsibility. In contrast, the prosecution argued that Gacy was fully aware of his actions and carried them out with clear intent and calculation. They emphasized that his behavior demonstrated planning and control rather than a lack of awareness. This position directly opposed the defense's claims, creating a clear conflict between the two sides. The prosecution maintained that his actions were deliberate and consistent with someone who understood the nature and consequences of his behavior. This contrast between the insanity defense and the argument for accountability formed the central focus of the trial. The legal proceedings examined both perspectives in detail, ultimately requiring the court to determine whether Gacy could be considered legally responsible for his actions. The evidence presented played a crucial role in shaping this decision, as both sides attempted to establish the truth of his mental state and intent. The court ultimately rejected the insanity plea, concluding that Gacy was fully responsible for his crimes. This decision confirmed that he was capable of understanding his actions and the consequences that followed. As a result, he was sentenced to death, bringing the legal process to a definitive conclusion and transitioning the case toward its final outcome. This ruling established accountability and set the stage for the final resolution of the case. Following his conviction, John Wayne Gacy was sentenced to death, marking the legal conclusion of the case against him. The sentencing reflected the court's decision that he was fully responsible for his actions and would face the ultimate penalty under the law. This judgment brought the lengthy legal process to a definitive end, closing the formal proceedings that had examined both his actions and his mental state. In 1994, Gacy was executed, formally ending his life and bringing the case to its final resolution. His execution marked the completion of the justice system's response to the crimes he had committed. With this event, the case reached its legal conclusion, providing a clear endpoint to the process that had begun with the investigation years earlier. While his execution represented closure from a legal perspective, the impact of his crimes continued to resonate. The case remains widely recognized as one of the most disturbing in American history due to both the number of victims and the nature of his actions. His ability to maintain a normal public life while concealing such crimes remains a defining and unsettling aspect of the case. The contrast between his outward appearance and the hidden reality of his behavior is a central element in understanding the lasting significance of the case. To those who knew him, he appeared as a respectable and active member of the community, yet beneath that image existed a reality that remained concealed for years. This stark difference between perception and truth continues to be a key point of reflection. In closing, the sentencing and execution of Gacy brought legal closure, but the case itself endures as a significant and unsettling chapter in criminal history. It stands as a reminder of how deeply hidden actions can exist behind ordinary appearances, and how those actions can only be revealed through persistent investigation and evidence. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in 1960, entering a household marked by instability and emotional strain. His father was frequently absent for long periods, leaving the family without consistent guidance or support. His mother was reported to be unstable and had attempted suicide at least once, further contributing to a tense and uncertain home environment. At the age of 4, following a hernia operation, Dahmer underwent a noticeable change in behavior, becoming more withdrawn and socially isolated. This shift marked a significant turning point in his early development, as he began to distance himself from others around him. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, his family moved frequently, including time spent living in Ohio, creating further instability in his upbringing. These constant relocations limited his ability to form lasting friendships and contributed to a lack of stability during his formative years. During this period, Dahmer also displayed early behavioral signs that would later become significant in understanding his actions. He developed a fascination with animal remains and bone structures, reflecting an unusual and concerning interest in anatomy. In one documented incident, he nailed the carcass of a dog to a tree located in the woods behind his home. This act stood out as an early example of disturbing behavior, highlighting the growing detachment between Dahmer and those around him. Together, these factors illustrate a childhood shaped by instability, isolation, and early signs of behaviors that would later escalate significantly. These developments are documented as part of his early life history and provide context for the environment and experiences that preceded his later actions as an adult in the years that followed thereafter. Dahmer's adolescence unfolded during his high school years, where he struggled to form meaningful social connections and increasingly withdrew from those around him. He had few friends and spent much of his time in isolation, a pattern that became more pronounced as he progressed through his teenage years. During this period, his reliance on alcohol also began to grow, and this dependence contributed to his further social withdrawal and detachment from peers. His teenage environment reflected a consistent absence of stable relationships, reinforcing his tendency toward isolation. During his time in high school, Dahmer also came to the realization that he was gay, which became a part of his personal development during his youth. This realization is presented as part of his broader adolescent experiences, alongside his growing isolation and behavioral changes, without introducing assumptions beyond the documented facts. At the same time, his fascination with death and anatomy persisted and became more defined. He maintained a particular interest in animal remains, reflecting a continued and observable pattern of curiosity regarding death-related subjects. This interest built upon earlier behaviors and remained a notable aspect of his adolescence. As he approached the end of high school, Dahmer's behavior remained consistent with this pattern of isolation and limited social interaction. In 1978, he graduated from high school, marking a clear transition point in his life. Shortly after this milestone, he began acting on his sexual impulses in ways that would later have severe consequences. This period represents the beginning of a shift from adolescence into early adulthood, where his actions began to move beyond observation and into behavior that carried serious outcomes. The documented details from this stage of his life remain focused on his social isolation, substance use, personal realization, and persistent interest in death-related subjects. Shortly after graduating high school in June 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer encountered one 8-year-old hitchhiker Stephen Hicks near Bath, Ohio. Dahmer offered Hicks a ride and brought him to his home while his parents were away. When Hicks expressed a desire to leave, Dahmer attacked him with a dumbbell, resulting in his death. Following the killing, Dahmer dismembered the body and used acid to dissolve parts, while crushing bones with a sledgehammer and disposing of the remains in nearby woods. These actions demonstrated a deliberate effort to eliminate evidence and conceal the crime. This murder marked the beginning of Dahmer's pattern of violent behavior and would be the first of multiple killings that followed. Some of these later acts involved additional disturbing elements, including sexual activity with victims either before or after death. This section remains strictly focused on documented actions, presenting the sequence of events without interpretation or added detail beyond the known facts. It establishes the transition from Dahmer's earlier life into his first confirmed act of murder. The event occurred while Dahmer was alone in the home, as his parents were away at the time of the incident. After the act, he proceeded with steps to ensure that no physical remains were easily traceable or recoverable. The handling of the body followed a methodical process that included dismemberment and chemical and mechanical destruction of remains. This incident is recorded as the first murder in Dahmer's history, establishing a pattern that would later be repeated in subsequent cases. It represents a critical point in the timeline, marking the moment when earlier behaviors transitioned into a confirmed and documented act of lethal violence. Following his first confirmed murder, Jeffrey Dahmer's life entered a period marked by instability and continued lack of direction. He briefly enrolled in college, but did not establish a lasting academic path. Around this same period, he entered service in the U.S. Army, serving for 2 years. Both of these experiences were characterized by heavy alcohol use, which negatively affected his behavior and ability to maintain structure in his life. The combination of these factors prevented him from achieving any sense of long-term stability or personal progress. His time in both college and the military did not result in sustained improvement, and instead reflected a continued pattern of decline. After completing his military service, Dahmer's difficulties persisted as he struggled to maintain consistent employment and direction. His lifestyle during this time continued to reflect instability, with no clear path towards stability or lasting change. In 1981, Dahmer returned to Wisconsin, where he moved in with his grandmother near Milwaukee. This marked a shift in his living situation and the beginning of a new phase in his life as he transitioned back into a domestic environment under family supervision. This section focuses strictly on these documented events, outlining his movements between education, military service and residence without adding interpretation or speculation. Beginning in 1987, Jeffrey Dahmer's criminal activity escalated into a sustained and methodical pattern. During this period, he frequented Milwaukee's gay bars and bathhouses where he encountered potential victims. He developed a method of luring men by offering them drinks that were secretly laced with sedatives. This allowed him to gain control over individuals without immediate resistance, creating the conditions for further crimes to occur. In one documented incident in 1987, Dahmer met a young man and brought him to a motel room where he killed him. After the killing, he transported the body to his grandmother's home. There, he proceeded to dismember the corpse. Dahmer also saved the victim's skull as a sexual object and disposed of the remaining body parts. This act marked a significant point in his behavior as it demonstrated both repetition and escalation in his methods. Following this incident, Dahmer entered a period during which he no longer attempted to restrain his impulses. Between 1987 and 1991, he murdered at least 15 additional young males. His approach remained consistent throughout these years. He typically identified victims in public places, such as bus stations and bars, selecting individuals he could approach without drawing attention. Dahmer would often offer his victims money, usually around $50, in exchange for posing for photographs. Once they were inside his residence, he would drug them using sedatives, rendering them unable to resist. He then strangled the victims and engaged in post-mortem acts. Afterward, he used knives and acids to dismember their bodies. In some cases, he retained parts of the victims as trophies. During this period, Dahmer also encountered legal issues. He was arrested multiple times for offences, including indecent exposure and disorderly conduct. In 1988, he was arrested in connection with an incident involving the drugging and sexual assault of a 13-year-old boy, Somsak Synthesomphone. These incidents occurred alongside his ongoing pattern of violent crimes, reflecting a continued escalation in criminal behavior over time. Following Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest, forensic teams conducted a detailed search of his apartment, leading to the discovery of extensive and disturbing physical evidence. Inside the residence, investigators found human remains including multiple heads, severed limbs, internal organs, and a complete human skeleton. These findings indicated the presence of multiple victims and confirmed the scale of the crimes under investigation. In addition to the human remains, authorities uncovered various chemicals and tools used in the handling and preservation of bodies. These included substances such as chloroform and formaldehyde, which are associated with sedating and preserving biological material. Investigators also located tools such as saws and drills, which were consistent with the dismemberment of human remains. The presence of these items demonstrated the methods used in processing the bodies found within the apartment. Further evidence included photographic documentation of victims, as well as a 5-7-gallon drum containing acid. Inside this drum were multiple decomposing human torsos. The combination of these findings illustrated a systematic approach to the disposal and preservation of human remains. The layout of evidence within the apartment reflected, repeated, and organized activity over time, with materials and remains distributed across different areas of the space. During the investigation, Dahmer was interrogated multiple times by law enforcement. In these sessions, he provided detailed confessions regarding his actions. He admitted to murdering 16 victims in Wisconsin and one in Ohio, with the crimes occurring over a span of approximately 13 years. In addition to murder, he confessed to necrophilic acts and to the consumption of human body parts. These admissions aligned with the physical evidence recovered from his apartment and contributed to the overall understanding of the scope of his crimes. All information presented in this section remains strictly based on documented findings and statements made during the investigation process. Jeffrey Dahmer's legal proceedings began with his indictment on 15 counts of murder in Wisconsin, followed by an additional charge related to the murder committed in Ohio. These charges formally brought his documented crimes into the judicial system, initiating a full trial process. During the proceedings, Dahmer entered a plea of guilty but insane, a legal position that was challenged by the prosecution. This plea became a central point of contention in the case, as both sides presented expert testimony to support their arguments. Prosecutors introduced expert witnesses who testified that Dahmer was legally sane and capable of understanding and controlling his actions at the time of the offenses. In contrast, the defense presented experts who argued that Dahmer suffered from psychological disorders, including necrophilic impulses and borderline personality disorder. These opposing testimonies formed the basis of the legal debate regarding his mental state and criminal responsibility. After hearing the evidence, the jury deliberated for approximately 5 hours before reaching a verdict. Dahmer was found guilty on 15 counts of murder. Following the verdict, he was sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Wisconsin did not permit capital punishment, and this sentence reflected the maximum penalty available under state law. An additional life sentence was later imposed for the Ohio murder, bringing the total to 16 life sentences. In his final statement to the court, Dahmer acknowledged the harm caused by his actions. He stated that he understood the extent of the damage he had inflicted and expressed a belief regarding his condition. This statement was presented during sentencing and marked the conclusion of his trial proceedings. The section remains strictly focused on the legal process, verdict, and sentencing outcomes as documented in the case. Jeffrey Dahmer was incarcerated at the Columbia Correctional Institution, where he was initially placed in protective custody due to concerns for his safety. During his time in prison, he reportedly converted to Christianity and was baptized in the prison whirlpool. These events occurred while he remained under supervision within the correctional facility as part of his life in custody following his sentencing. His incarceration marked the final phase of his life as he served multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. On the 28th of November 1994, Dahmer was assigned to a prison work detail alongside other inmates. During this time, he was attacked by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver. The assault resulted in Dahmer being fatally beaten with an iron bar. Another inmate present during the attack was also killed in the same incident. The event took place within the prison environment and ended Dahmer's life while he was serving his sentence. Following the incident, the circumstances of the attack were reported by prison authorities. Scarver later made a statement regarding his actions, stating, "God told me to do it." This statement was documented as part of the aftermath of the attack. The deaths of Dahmer and the other inmate occurred as a direct result of the assault during the work detail. The Dahmer case had a significant and lasting impact on public perception, particularly in relation to law enforcement practices and community trust. It highlighted tensions between Milwaukee law enforcement and the black community, as many of Dahmer's victims were black individuals whose disappearances were not thoroughly investigated. This raised concerns about how certain cases were handled and brought attention to disparities in investigative responses. A key figure in the public impact of the case was Glenda Cleveland, a neighbor who repeatedly contacted police to report suspicious activity. Despite her efforts, her concerns were largely ignored, which later became a point of criticism regarding the handling of information by authorities. This situation contributed to broader questions about responsiveness and accountability within law enforcement during the time of the case. The case also drew criticism for how officers responded in specific incidents, particularly involving victims such as Konarak synthesomphone. The handling of this situation became a focal point in discussions about how victims were treated and whether appropriate investigative steps were taken when warning signs were present. Beyond law enforcement and community issues, the Dahmer case also influenced cultural and media representation. It inspired several books and media portrayals, including written works such as The Jeffrey Dahmer Story, An American Nightmare by Donald Davis, and The Shrine of Jeffrey Dahmer by Brian Masters. It was also adapted into film and television, including the 2002 film Dahmer, the 2022 series Dahmer, Monster, The Jeffrey Dahmer Story, and the 2023 series My Son Jeffrey. The Dahmer Family Tapes. These works reflect the continued public interest in the case. Overall, the Dahmer case left a lasting impact on public awareness, law enforcement scrutiny, and media representation, shaping ongoing discussions about investigative practices and the portrayal of true crime cases. From late 1989 through late 1990, Central Florida became the focus of a series of incidents involving 7 middle-aged white men discovered across multiple counties. Each victim was robbed before being shot, and their vehicles were taken, forming a consistent pattern that linked the cases. The incidents were not confined to a single area, with victims found in Volusia, Citrus, Pasco, Marion, Suwannee, and Dixie counties, reflecting a wide geographic spread that complicated early investigative efforts. Law enforcement agencies began to identify similarities between the incidents, particularly the repeated use of firearms and the consistent removal of personal property from the victims' vehicles. The first known victim was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old shop owner who was last seen after encountering a woman along Interstate 75 inches, Florida. His body was later discovered several miles from his abandoned car with multiple gunshot injuries to the chest. Following Mallory's case, additional victims were identified, including David Spears, Charles Carskadon, Troy Burris, Charles Humphreys, Peter Sims, and Walter Antonio, each discovered under similar circumstances involving shootings and vehicle theft. The bodies were found in varied conditions, from well-preserved to decomposed, depending on the time elapsed before discovery. In each case, investigators noted that the victims shared demographic similarities and were targeted in ways that suggested a single perpetrator or closely related series of incidents, prompting a broader and more coordinated law enforcement response across Central Florida. Authorities continued linking the cases through forensic findings and recovered property, reinforcing the pattern of robbery followed by shootings, while the investigation expanded as more evidence connected the victims across the region in a coordinated effort. Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old shop owner, was found dead after picking up a woman along Interstate 75. His body was discovered several miles from his abandoned car, and he had been shot multiple times in the chest. The sequence continued with David Spears, a 43-year-old construction worker who was found and had multiple gunshot injuries to the torso. Charles Carskadon, a 40-year-old rodeo worker, was later discovered having been shot several times in the chest and stomach. Troy Burris, a 50-year-old salesman, was found in a decomposed state, with medical findings indicating gunshot injuries to the torso. Charles Dick Humphreys, a retired Air Force major and law enforcement official, was found fully clothed, but had sustained multiple gunshot injuries to the head and torso. Peter Sims, age 65, is another victim whose body was never recovered, though his car and witness accounts suggested foul play in connection with his disappearance. Walter Antonio was found in a remote area with his body showing gunshot injuries, and his car was discovered days later in a separate location. Across each case, investigators observed recurring elements including the use of firearms, robbery, and the taking of vehicles, which consistently linked these incidents into a single pattern across Central Florida. Law enforcement authorities examined each victim in detail, noting the similarities in the method of attack and the locations where the bodies were ultimately found. These discoveries reinforced the understanding that the incidents were not isolated, but instead part of a connected sequence spanning multiple counties. The varying conditions of the bodies also provided important context for investigators, indicating differences in the timing and circumstances of discovery. Despite these variations, the consistent use of firearms and the repeated taking of personal property remained central to the case. Each victim was ultimately tied together through these shared characteristics, allowing law enforcement to recognize the broader scope of the investigation and pursue connections between the separate incidents. The structured sequence of events highlighted the pattern of targeting middle-aged men in different counties across Central Florida, reinforcing the link between each case. Eileen Lee Carol Warnos was born on the 29th of February 1956 in Rochester, Michigan. Her early life included serious family issues, and her father later died while in prison. She and her brother were left after their mother abandoned them at a young age, and they were raised by their grandparents. Reports describe difficulties within the household, including claims that her grandfather was physically harsh and her grandmother struggled with alcohol. At age 11, Warnos began exchanging favors for money and basic needs, marking the beginning of her early involvement in street survival activities. By age 14, she gave birth to a child, who was later given up for adoption. Shortly afterward, she left home and lived on the streets, in wooded areas, or while hitchhiking under assumed names. In the early 1980s, following her brother's death, Warnos moved to Florida and worked in street-based activities. Over time, she accumulated multiple arrests, including charges related to firearm possession, forgery, physical altercations, and robbery. Authorities frequently described her behavior as erratic and aggressive in official records. In 1986, Warnos entered into a relationship with Tyria Moore, which became an important part of her personal life. Her clients were typically middle-aged, lower-income white men, matching the general profile of the individuals later identified in the case. This pattern remained consistent as she continued working in Florida, where her life circumstances were shaped by instability and repeated interactions with the legal system. Her history of arrests and legal issues reflected a pattern of ongoing conflict with authorities, reinforcing descriptions of her as volatile and difficult to manage during official encounters. The relationship with Tyria Moore represented a significant personal connection during this period, lasting several years before the events that later led to her detention. Throughout this time, Warnos continued to operate within environments where she encountered individuals similar to those later identified as individuals in the series of incidents. Additionally, these elements establish a consistent, fact-based overview of her early life and circumstances. Investigators began connecting the incidents through the discovery of physical evidence linked to Richard Mallory at a pawn shop. Among the items recovered was a receipt bearing Warnos's thumbprint, providing a direct forensic link between her and the stolen property. This discovery marked a critical point in the investigation, as it established a tangible connection between Warnos and one of the earliest identified individuals. Following this lead, law enforcement traced additional items belonging to Mallory. These items included a camera that was later found in a rented warehouse unit. The unit had been secured using a key associated with Warnos, and records indicated that it had been rented under an alternate name. This use of a different identity and controlled storage location further strengthened the connection between Warnos and the recovered property. As investigators expanded their search, they identified additional stolen items that could be linked to Warnos. These items were traced to various individuals and locations, including pawn shops and private transactions. The consistent appearance of property tied to individuals in connection with Warnos reinforced the growing body of evidence. Each discovery added another layer to the investigation, helping law enforcement establish a clearer pattern of activity centered around the movement of stolen goods. The pawnshop trail became a crucial element in the case, as it demonstrated how items belonging to individuals were being circulated through identifiable commercial and private channels. By following these transactions, investigators were able to map connections between the individuals and Warnos, ultimately creating a documented path of evidence. In the case of Peter Seams, although his body was never uncovered, investigative leads included witness accounts describing 2 women seen near his abandoned vehicle. These accounts provided additional context for the investigation, contributing to the broader effort to understand his disappearance. Overall, the combination of physical evidence, financial records, and recovered stolen property played a central role in building the case against Warnos. Each piece of evidence contributed to a growing network of connections that tied her to multiple individuals. Law enforcement relied on these documented links to establish a consistent pattern of activity, forming the foundation of the case through verified evidence without reliance on speculation or assumptions beyond the recorded facts. By 1990, Tyria Moore, Warnos's partner, had begun to grow suspicious of her activities. As these suspicions increased, Moore chose to leave Florida and move to Pennsylvania, distancing herself from Warnos and the situation developing around her. This separation became an important development in the investigation, as Moore's departure marked a shift in her involvement and relationship with Warnos. Law enforcement later located Tyria Moore and brought her into cooperation with the investigation. Authorities used her position to assist in gathering information related to Warnos and the ongoing case. Her involvement provided investigators with an opportunity to further their inquiry through direct interaction connected to Warnos's personal and legal activities. Warnos was subsequently detained at a biker bar in Harbor Oaks, Florida, where she was taken into custody on an outstanding warrant. This detention represented a significant step in the legal process, as it brought her under formal supervision and allowed authorities to proceed with additional investigative measures. Following her detention, police utilized Moore's cooperation to help obtain a statement from Warnos. This statement became a key component in the case, as it directly connected Warnos to the incidents under investigation. It provided law enforcement with information that supported the physical evidence and other findings gathered throughout the investigation. The detention and subsequent statement marked a turning point in the case, transitioning it from an active investigation into a prosecutable matter within the legal system. With Warnos in custody and a statement obtained, authorities were able to move forward with formal charges and begin building the legal framework required to present the case in court. This stage of the investigation solidified the connection between Warnos and the series of incidents, relying on documented cooperation, recorded statements, and established procedures. The combination of Moore's involvement and Warnos's statement strengthened the evidentiary basis of the case, allowing law enforcement to proceed with confidence in the legal process and move toward trial proceedings based on verified information. Following Eileen Warnos's detention and statement, the case transitioned from active investigation into formal legal proceedings within the judicial system. Law enforcement and prosecutors began preparing the collected evidence for presentation in court, marking a shift from evidence gathering to prosecution. This stage represented the formal entry of the case into the legal framework, where charges would be evaluated and determined through judicial processes. The significance of the collected evidence became central at this point. Pawnshop records, including receipts and documented transactions, provided a direct link between stolen property and Warnos. Recovered items belonging to the individuals further strengthened the connection, showing a pattern of theft associated with the incidents. These pieces of evidence were essential in establishing a documented chain linking Warnos to the individuals and the circumstances of their deaths. In addition to physical evidence, witness accounts and investigative findings played an important role in supporting the case. Statements from individuals connected to the investigation, along with recorded observations, contributed to building a comprehensive understanding of the events. These elements worked together to form a structured body of evidence that could be examined in court. The transition to trial marked the conclusion of the investigative phase and the beginning of judicial review. At this stage, all evidence collected by law enforcement was organized and prepared for legal examination, ensuring that the case could be evaluated according to established legal standards. This section serves as a bridge into the next phase of the documentary, where the focus will shift from investigation to courtroom proceedings. With the investigation complete, the case now moves into the judicial process, where the evidence, testimony, and legal arguments will be examined in detail as part of the trial.